Around 6 o'clock in the evening on June 20th, 2022, paramedics were urgently called to a small residence in Setúbal, Portugal. There they found Jessica Biscaia, a child of only 3 years old, with her body covered in bruises and completely dilated pupils, a clear sign that something terrible had happened. Hours later, despite all attempts at resuscitation, little Jessica would die before even reaching the hospital. Her body showed more than 130 injuries, including marks of brutal assaults, bruises all over her body, and signs of torture that shocked even the most experienced doctors. The girl, who should have been playing at a summer camp, as her mother had told her partner, had actually been the victim of one of the most barbaric crimes ever recorded in Portugal, involving an alleged witch, a debt of €800, and 5 days of unimaginable torture. Stay until the end to understand how a simple witchcraft consultation transformed into one of the most disturbing stories in Setúbal, where an innocent child was used as a collection instrument by a woman who claimed to be capable of controlling supernatural forces. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, take the opportunity to subscribe now and activate the bell to not miss any case as impactful as this one. Inés Sanchez, at 37 years old, lived an existence marked by poverty and domestic violence in Setúbal, Portugal. Mother of 6 children, her life was a living portrait of the structural poverty that perpetuates through generations. 4 of her children lived with relatives, as she was unable to care for them amid so many difficulties. Her eldest daughter had been institutionalized at the request of her own maternal grandmother, who saw in this measure the only chance for a better future for her granddaughter. Now, Inés was placing her last hopes in a new relationship with Paulo Amancio, fearing that this partner would abandon her too, as so many others had done. The apartment where they lived was tiny and precarious, located in one of the poorest neighborhoods of Setúbal. Jessica, her 3-year-old daughter, didn't even have her own room. She slept in an improvised corner of the living room. The girl had been monitored by the hospital nucleus for children and young people at risk since her first month of life. Due to the constant aggression her mother suffered from the child's biological father, Nelson, neighbors frequently called the police due to episodes of violence, and mother and daughter even lived on the streets when they were forced to leave their home. It was in this context of deep emotional and social vulnerability that Inés met Ana Cristina Pinto, Tita, a 52-year-old woman who exercised strong influence in the local community. Tita presented herself as a powerful seer and practitioner of witchcraft, exploiting the faith and desperation of the most vulnerable. In her first meeting with Inés, she boasted about her supposed supernatural powers, displaying an altar full of candles, saints, and other mystical objects in her house, which was just a few blocks from Inés's residence. Tita's proposal seemed like the solution to all of Inés's problems, a powerful love-binding spell that would ensure Paulo would never abandon her. The price charged was €800, an astronomical amount for a woman who could barely feed her youngest daughter. Desperate and believing in Tita's powers, Inés accepted the spiritual work, without having any idea how she would pay for it. As the payment demands intensified, Tita revealed her true nature. Her demands became increasingly aggressive, and she began to devise a plan that would demonstrate her cruelty. The self-proclaimed witch didn't act alone. She counted on the complicity of her husband Justo Montes, 58 years old, a man known for his violent temperament, and her daughter Esmeralda, 27 years old, who actively participated in her mother's schemes. The plan to capture Jessica was elaborated with a calculating coldness that would shock even the most experienced investigators. Tita used her own granddaughter, a girl the same age as Jessica, as bait. The 2 children used to play together, which made everything even more perverse. On an apparently normal day, Tita invited Jessica to play with her granddaughter, as she had done other times. The little one, innocent and cheerful like any 3-year-old child, had no way of knowing that this would be the beginning of her ordeal. Once having the child in her power, Tita revealed her true intentions to Inés. Jessica would be held hostage until the debt was paid. The woman who claimed to be capable of controlling supernatural forces now showed that her true strength came from the most basic human cruelty. What began as a naive search for love through beliefs in mystical powers would transform into the prelude to one of the most brutal stories ever recorded in Portugal. The house that transformed into a chamber of horrors for Jessica would be the stage for systematic cruelty that would last exactly 5 days. What Tita, her husband Justo, and her daughter Esmeralda did during this period would surpass the limits of what investigators considered possible in terms of brutality against a child. In the very first hours of captivity, the family began to execute a meticulously thought-out torture plan to pressure Ines. With each phone call, they made sure the mother heard Jessica's desperate screams in the background. Ines, paralyzed by fear and helplessness, recognized her daughter's voice in practically every call but was threatened if she tried to seek help. The psychological terror was calculated. Sometimes, they would let the girl speak briefly with her mother, only to resume the aggression afterward, whose sounds echoed through the phone. The torture methods quickly escalated in brutality. Using their physical strength, the 3 adults took turns in beating sessions that would leave 130 documented injuries all over the child's body. These weren't simple aggressions. They were systematic acts that included punches, kicks, and blows with objects. Little Jessica had bruises on her face, injured lips, and marks all over her body, some so deep that medical examiners would later have difficulty cataloging them. To silence the child's screams and avoid suspicion from neighbors, the trio resorted to an even more perverse method. They began drugging Jessica. Subsequent investigations would reveal that they went as far as putting cocaine in her diaper, a cruel technique that allowed the drug to be slowly absorbed by the girl's body. The child alternated between states of consciousness and unconsciousness, but this didn't prevent the aggression from continuing. One of the most disturbing aspects of the captivity was the active participation of all family members. Esmeralda, who was also mother to a girl the same age as Jessica, showed no maternal empathy. Justo, with his superior physical strength, was especially brutal in his aggressions. And Tita, the supposed witch who promised to help people through supernatural powers, coordinated the entire operation with a coldness that would shock even experienced criminals. Neighborhood witnesses would later report to police that they heard crying and screaming coming from the house, but no one imagined the extent of the horror unfolding inside. The fact that Tita had a granddaughter of the same age who frequently played in the house served as a perfect smoke screen. Who would suspect that a grandmother would be capable of such cruelty against a child? As the days passed, Jessica's condition deteriorated rapidly. The aggression didn't cease, and the continuous use of drugs to keep her sedated began to have visible effects on her small body. Her eyes, once bright and cheerful like those of any 3-year-old child, now remained constantly dilated, an alarming sign of the chemical intoxication she was being subjected to. On the 5th day of captivity, something changed. Little Jessica's body began to show signs that it couldn't take much more. Her reactions were increasingly slow, and even moments of consciousness became rare. That's when the kidnappers realized they had gone too far, not because they cared about the child's life, but because a fatal outcome could result in much more serious consequences for them. Realizing the situation had gotten out of control, Tita made a decision that would definitively seal little Jessica's fate. On the morning of that Monday, June 20th, 2022, she summoned Ines to pick up her daughter. What the mother found was a scene that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Her little girl was practically inert, with her body covered in bruises and frighteningly dilated eyes. Tita, in a final demonstration of her calculating cruelty, still tried to cover up the situation. She gave Ines some medications, saying they were to calm the girl, and instructed her not to seek medical help immediately. The threats continued. If Ines reported what had happened, not only she but her entire family would suffer consequences. Paralyzed by fear and guilt, Ines made a decision that would become her greatest torment. She took Jessica home, hoping she would get better with time. Arriving at the residence she shared with her partner Paolo Amancio, she tried to explain her daughter's condition with a poorly crafted story about a fall at daycare. She mentioned a supposed medication called Atterix, which would justify the child's lethargic state. The following hours were crucial and devastating. While Jessica lay motionless, her small body fought a losing battle against the damage caused by 5 days of torture and drugs. Paolo, although suspecting that something much more serious had happened, couldn't extract the truth from Ines, who remained trapped between fear of Tita's threats and terror of admitting her own participation in the tragedy. It was only at the beginning of that night, around 6 o'clock, when Jessica began having seizures, that Ines finally found the courage to call an ambulance. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but the scenario they found was devastating. The girl showed purple spots all over her body, bruises on her abdomen, and most alarmingly, her pupils were completely dilated, a classic sign of severe brain damage. The emergency team immediately began resuscitation procedures. Right there, in the small apartment in one of the poorest neighborhoods of Setúbal, a frantic race against time began. The professionals were fighting not only against the visible physical damage, but also against the unknown effects of substances that had been administered to the child during captivity. The ambulance departed at high speed for São Bernardo Hospital in Setúbal, with sirens cutting through the night silence. During the journey, the paramedics didn't cease their resuscitation attempts. Ines, seated next to her daughter in the ambulance, watched helplessly while the professionals did everything to keep her little girl alive. Amid the resuscitation maneuvers and the sound of emergency equipment, Jessica Sofia Tomas Biscaia, just 3 years old, exhaled her last breath in her mother's arms before even reaching the hospital. The emergency room doctors, upon receiving little Jessica's body, still attempted more resuscitation maneuvers, but it was too late. Death was officially declared, and an experienced medical team, accustomed to dealing with daily tragedies, couldn't contain their tears upon finding more than 57 visible signs of aggression on the girl's body. The attending physician, fulfilling his legal and moral duty, immediately contacted the police authorities. Jessica's death would not be just another statistic. It would be the beginning of an investigation that would expose one of Portugal's darkest stories. With little Jessica's body now under the care of the medical legal team at São Bernardo Hospital, the fragile story constructed by Ines began to crumble quickly. The narrative about a supposed summer camp and an accidental fall at daycare didn't resist the first questioning by Setúbal Judicial Police investigators. After all, what daycare was this that nobody knew about? Where were the belongings that Jessica would have taken to this supposed summer camp? The detectives, upon visiting the apartment where Ines and Paulo lived, noticed something disturbing. There weren't even traces of a child's existence in that house. No photos, no toys, no clothes. Paulo tried to explain that they had thrown everything away to not bring painful memories, but the justification sounded increasingly empty in the face of accumulating evidence. Under the growing pressure from investigators and the crushing weight of guilt, Ines finally began to reveal the truth. Between tears and sobs, she narrated the story of the debt with Tita, Jessica's kidnapping, and the 5 days of terror that her daughter had endured. Each emerging detail made the case even more shocking. The investigators could hardly believe that everything had begun because of a supposed spiritual work worth €800. When the police arrived at Tita's house, it was already late. The self-proclaimed witch, her husband Justo, and her daughter Esmeralda had fled. The place was ransacked, with clear signs of a hasty departure. The neighbors, who previously kept silent, began to talk. They reported the screams they heard during the night, the constant crying of a child, the suspicious movements. One neighbor even mentioned seeing Tita frequently buying medications at different pharmacies in the region. The hunt for the fugitives mobilized the entire judicial police. For 48 hours, investigators searched every corner of Setúbal and neighboring cities. The breaking of the suspect's telephone privacy finally led authorities to Leiria, where the trio was found hidden in an abandoned house in the Cova das Feias neighborhood. The arrest was quick. The three were exhausted and had barely eaten during their flight. But it was the autopsy report that would reveal the true dimension of brutality. The document, which caused commotion even among the most experienced coroners, cataloged 130 distinct injuries on the girl's body. These weren't just bruises and abrasions. There were burns, deep cuts, and internal injuries consistent with systematic torture. The presence of cocaine in her system confirmed the use of the drug as a containment method. The examinations also revealed that Jessica had been subjected to other types of torture that investigators preferred not to detail publicly. The medical examiner responsible for the case declared that in his 20 years of career, he had never seen such cruelty against a child. The injuries indicated that the girl had been assaulted by at least 3 different people, confirming the active participation of all family members in the crime. The brutality documented in the autopsy report was decisive for the public ministry to decide to indict the trio for qualified homicide, in addition to charges of kidnapping, torture, and extortion. The document also raised serious questions about the time lapse between the first aggressions and the search for medical help, which would lead to even greater scrutiny of Inés's role in the entire tragedy. The revelations kept emerging. The investigation discovered that Tita was already known in the region for her supposed practice of witchcraft, having extorted money from other vulnerable people. However, no one imagined she would be capable of transforming a debt collection into such a heinous crime. The house that served as an office for her mystical practices had become a torture chamber for an innocent child, whose only crime was having a mother desperate enough to believe in promises of love through black magic. The news of Jessica's brutal death ignited the streets of Setúbal. What began as shock and sadness quickly transformed into a wave of popular revolt unprecedented in the city's recent history. Television stations, which transmitted the case uninterruptedly, transformed each development into a public spectacle of collective indignation. The peak of popular commotion occurred during Jessica's wake, held at the chapel of Our Lady of the Annunciation. What should have been a moment of mourning and farewell transformed into a visceral demonstration of the fury of Setúbal's residents. Hundreds of people gathered in front of the chapel, many shouting for justice, others threatening to take justice into their own hands. When Inés arrived for her daughter's wake, escorted by police officers, the crowd exploded in shouts of "murderer." A woman managed to break through the police cordon and deliver a punch to Jessica's mother's face. The chaos was such that the police needed to remove Inés from the location for her own safety. She fainted during the removal and couldn't say goodbye to her daughter. The funeral, held the next day, transformed into an even more dramatic event. The funeral procession more resembled a procession of collective fury. The car carrying the small coffin was followed by a crowd that alternated between prayers and shouts of revolt. Jessica's biological father, who had traveled from Holland for the funeral, took the shovel from the gravedigger and began to bury his daughter himself, in a gesture loaded with symbolism and pain. In August 2023, more than 1 year after the crime, justice finally presented its response. The Setúbal court condemned Ana Cristina Tita Pinto, her husband Justo Montes, and her daughter Esmeralda to the maximum penalty provided by Portuguese legislation: 25 years in prison for each one. The sentence was confirmed in January 2024 by the Évora Court of Appeal, with no possibility of reduction. What do you think could have prevented this tragedy? Leave your comment below. If you're not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now and activate the bell to not miss any case as impactful as this one. See you in the next case.